Okay.
They were crazy as in South Carolina.
Got the microphone. She's got one there.
She's got one.
As
There's one.
a couple days ago, but yeah, they're just like everywhere. All these ponds, don't feed them.
Is it on?
Well, you know, if you do, then they'll always stink. It's like a dog. It's just like a dog.
Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to our CAS program and meeting. And our featured speaker tonight is Dr. Gayle Fritz, who's Professor Emeritus Department of Anthropology at Washington University. Been involved for most of her career in paleoethnobotany and related studies, and also she's very interested in gender studies as well. So, and that's sort of the emphasis, I think, of her program tonight, recognizing Mississippian women, comparison of Joara, is that pronounced right?
Joara.
Joara, North Carolina, and Cahokia, Illinois. Dr. Fritz.
Thank you, Bill. So I'd like to start off with the land recognition. Osage Nation, Illinois Confederacy, other First Nations whose ancestral land we are on now. And then since I'm also going to be talking about North Carolina, Catawba, Cherokee, and other tribes of Western, North, and South Carolina, and indigenous people who came together in the American Bottom and in the Carolinas. So when Bill asked me a couple of months ago if I would think about giving a talk to the CAS, I tried to think of something new and different, and something that wasn't just technical things about plants that would bore everybody to tears. So I remembered, I realized that I have a chapter coming out in an edited volume that's scheduled for publication in 2024, and that I'm a co-author of another chapter in the same volume, one first on Cahokia, the Mississippian Women volume, the second on the women in power at Joara, Cuenca, and Fort San Juan, which is in a site in western North Carolina. And I thought if I tried to be very creative, I could weave them together in a way that might give me, if nobody, hi.
Go on.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's why, okay.
New insights, new ways of thinking about both of these places and the women who live there. So you all know where Cahokia is. Here we are up here, and Joara, as I just mentioned, is in the western North Carolina Piedmont. And it was a native town that was visited both by DeSoto, the DeSoto expedition. He was there in 1540 with his 500 men and all of his entourage. And then later, and he called it Joala, and you'll see that in a minute. And then Captain Juan Pardo, another Spanish explorer, conquistador, invader, was there 26 years later. And he...
Could you point, because I can't read from back here. Just point to.
So here is Joara,
Okay, thank you.
and I'll show you some better maps, some more specific maps later on. But you can see it's pretty far away. Joara is here in the south, what they call South Appalachian Mississippian, and Cahokia is way up here toward the northern end of the Mississippian world. Joara is also known, maybe more commonly actually known, as the Berry site. And that's from the landowners, and it's privately owned by the Berry family and has been for generations. So there are many contrasts between Cahokia and Joara. Cahokia is much earlier, or several centuries earlier. And starting at, well, of course, there were things going on at both places before these sort of climax dates. But Cahokia at its peak between 1000 or 1050 and 1350 or 1400 CE. And Joara being occupied primarily during, although again there was a little bit going on earlier, but primarily much later during what is known as the Burke phase, and which includes the European contact episodes, and later. Cahokia was much, much bigger, with 120 mounds and and the vast region that its influence extended to. Joara had one mound, only about 15 feet tall, when it was first observed by the Smithsonian expedition in the late 1800s. And I tell you, if you go there now, I mean, when I first went there, I wouldn't have known there was a mound there at all. It was plowed down to less than a meter in height. And Cahokia, as you all know, was an urban center. Joara was more of a town. I haven't heard them estimate the population size, and not enough is known about the village area itself, but certainly not anywhere, I mean, vastly smaller than Cahokia. And Cahokia was at the top of a multi-tiered settlement system. And there was something of a settlement hierarchy also in western North Carolina and elsewhere in the southeast. But Joara was not that much bigger than the surrounding villages and towns. Big difference is that because of its earliness and the fact that it was depopulated before European contact, we have no written records, no archives for Cahokia while it was being occupied by the Mississippians. And that's very different from Joara. We have archival documents from, even though we would like more, we would like to know a lot more, we do have them from the De Soto expedition and from the Pardo expedition. And then we have now one document that's receiving some more attention from historians that dates to even a little bit later. There are commonalities in that they were both Mississippian. They depended upon agriculture with maize, squash, tobacco, and other crops having been found at both places, even though there are significant differences between the archaeobotanical assemblages of the two sites. There were inherited hierarchical leadership positions, and there was a division of labor, similar division of labor for economic tasks. So at contact, and we're extending back to Cahokia from what we know from ethnographic descriptions across eastern North America and the plains. The women were the farmers, and the men were hunters and warriors and negotiators, although women were also important leaders, as I will make my case for. Another commonality is that I did analyze plant remains from both sides. I worked at the Berry site at Joara in North Carolina, setting up the flotation system and supervising the flotation and analyzing as many samples as I could, although there are a lot more that now I'm going to pass on to somebody else. I'm not sure who. Well, the Berry site project directors will pass it on. With my blessing, I'm sure. But and I did not analyze most of the archaeobotanical remains from Cahokia. There are many other hardworking and dedicated and excellent archaeobotanists who did that analysis. But I did a little bit, just a tiny fraction, and I put a lot of information together for the book, Feeding Cahokia. I'm a proud member of the Exploring Joara Foundation, which is like the Cahokia Archaeological Society and the Cahokia Mounds Museum Society, a support group. We do a lot of, both societies and associations do a lot of public outreach. Here you see a field day, an open house where so many people come to the Berry site and receive information about it and learn about archaeology. And they have events throughout the year, like this one, meetings. In fact, this is one that's on just recently. I'm sorry, it's sort of out of focus, but by a Catawba native tribal member about becoming Catawba. And during the pandemic, they had a webinar series. And she gave one of the webinars and one of the presentations, as did I. So this was one of my slides from that presentation. And I was comparing and contrasting the my talk was about Cahokia, was focused on Cahokia. But at the very beginning, I knew that my audience there was much more familiar with Joara than they were with Cahokia. So I put this slide up. I said the Berry site, this is all true, I still stand by it several years later, had more corn. Both sides had a lot of corn, but the Berry site had more corn compared to the other plant remains. Much, much more nutshell, which is an interesting thing about the American bottom, is that during the height of the Mississippian period, we really don't get that much nutshell from the archaeobotanical assemblages, although I think some of it was coming in from the uplands after having already been processed. Because the Berry site is so much later, it has beans. Beans didn't really become much of a crop at all until after 1250 CE across eastern North America. And even though we have occupation, we have the whole Moorhead phase that postdates 1250, starting at 1200, we don't get very many beans, hardly any, at Cahokia, even in its latest phases. And then Cahokia has the Eastern Agricultural Complex. And when you analyze flotation samples, especially from emergent Mississippian and Loman phase and Sterling phase, that's before 1200 CE, from anywhere in the American bottom or even a broader area, you get a huge, millions sometimes, hundreds of thousands at least, or thousands of the members of the Eastern Agricultural Complex that I will show you a slide of in a little bit. Both have minor amounts because they preserve so poorly in the archaeobotanical record of squash, and then a few tobacco seeds are exciting specimens to recover, and they have been found at both sites. And then both sites have grapes and persimmons and other fruits in significant quantities as well. When I showed this slide, or after in the question and answer period at the end of the presentation, David Moore, who's one of the co-PIs, Dr. Moore, one of the principal investigators at the Berry site at Joara, said, that's the first time I've ever seen the Berry site and Cahokia put on the same slide in a presentation. So I'm trying to take that comparison even farther tonight.
We had somebody ask what kind of tobacco seeds they were.
That's a good question. They're not the Caribbean tobacco. I only identified them to genus. The genus Nicotiana is the way I pronounce it. Some other people pronounce it differently, Nicotiana. And it's assumed that they're the species rustica. There's a lot of overlap among the different species, and I couldn't tell you how to be really certain that it's rustica rather than one of the native Western North American species, such as Bigelovii. But let's just say it's assumed that most of the pre-contact tobacco is rustica, and it didn't look like tobacum, the Caribbean, that could have been introduced by that point in time. But it did not look like that. I think I have a picture later. Okay, so these are the co-PIs of the Berry Site project. Robin Beck, Christopher Rodning, David Moore, and now somebody who was just a student, a young up-and-coming archaeologist at the time that I worked there, but is now co-PI, Dr. Rachel Briggs. And she's been extremely valuable member of the project, especially in terms of recognizing women at Joara. Can you all see this map at all in the back? So they have done a lot of work at Joara. Dave Moore, when he was a graduate student with me at North Carolina Chapel Hill in the 1980s, he initiated excavations in the mound area. And that was his part of his dissertation research. And then starting in the mid-1990s, they conducted geophysical survey. They had been doing, including Rob Beck, who is a cousin of the Berries, is a member of the extended family, had been doing surface survey, and they had been finding really interesting things like, you know, your early European types of artifacts, and they knew that this was in the path of both DeSoto and Joara. And so for Rob Beck now, Dr. Robin Beck, to be able to be, you know, one of the key principal investigators here has been really exciting. Anyway, when they did the geophysical surveys here, they found these house structures, not buried all that deeply, fortunately not completely destroyed by plowing, because of the fact that the creek that runs by here, Upper Creek, has flooded and deposited enough of a overburden to escape some of the plows. And they weren't using deep plows either. They were using shallower plows. So these burned structures up here just popped up just beautifully. And now they have excavated structure 1 and structure 5, and they know where the other structures are. And then they shifted to a lot of pits, a whole lot of pits. Excavations have been ongoing every year, even during the pandemic. They might have taken 1 year off, I'm not sure, since 2001. And they're now concentrating on what they hadn't even found when I was working there 15 years ago, but the fort itself, the moat, and the footings of the actual fort. And the Native American village, which has not received very much excavation and which is not very visible in the geophysical surveys as well, is down here. They are working on some structures just in recent years, on the way. And these look even maybe like later, like after the Spanish occupation. We can talk about how that happened to Joara happened to continue and even grow in size and influence, it looks like, after they drove the Spaniards out. So here are two artists' reconstructions, and I like the size of the fields in the one on the right. This is just some little garden that wouldn't at all reflect how major the agricultural activities were. The houses look somewhat the same, and then here is you probably can't see this Spanish guy who's supervising the natives in the building of the stockade or palisade around the fort itself. Here's the creek bending around on the east and on the north. I like the mound better on that one. I think this mound is pretty puny. It's got a couple of conquistadors standing on top of it if you look carefully. But and then the village would be down here. So give you an idea of what it might have looked like. As I mentioned, they had been finding surface finds of glass and Spanish olive jar sherds and metal, nails and other things for some time. There had been a Moravian settlement there really early in the colonial period, and people were not jumping to conclusions about what this metal, these nails and other things dated to. But as they started to accumulate and they started to take them to the people who had worked at the colonial site of Santa Elena, which is contemporaneous with the Berry site on the coast, they started getting more and more certain that this is what they had, was either DeSoto or Pardo or both. This is just a handful of what they found. They really, it's not overwhelming. It could be more exciting. You can work like a whole day on a feature and hardly find anything, or maybe even not find anything that day. But it accumulates over a season. Mostly what you find there is Native American artifacts. It's not, when working in the Spanish compound, which is where the plant remains that I analyzed came from, you don't get a lot of lithics, but you get a lot of ceramics. And these pits had a lot of ceramics too, and they reflect the Burke phase, the Western Piedmont, Upper Catawba, River Valley, occupation between 1400 and 1600 CE. However, there are some what we would call like non-local ceramics, and mostly this Pisgah phase, which is contemporaneous but is in the mountains. And whereas the Burke phase is assumed to be probably Proto-Catawba, which is a Siouan-speaking group in the Piedmont, the Pisgah phase probably reflects the Proto-Cherokee, but it's not all that far away. People were, known to be. They knew each other. They interacted. So I'm just going to try to breeze through the archaeobotanical analysis. I analyzed students, and I analyzed the remains from what was recovered from 76 10-liter soil samples. And it's a fairly large assemblage from, when I started to compare it with those from surrounding sites. There weren't very many that even approached that volume of that level of analysis. So it might not seem like a lot, but it is a sizable archaeobotanical assemblage. And it came from structures 1 and 5 and from a lot of those pits that you see around them. Also, David Moore had worked with a colleague, an archaeobotanist named Kristen Gremillon, who had analyzed flotation samples from the mound area when he worked there in the 1980s. So we know what they were eating, and it does not include, so far, there has been no sign of any kind of old world crops. Other sites like very early Spanish sites in the southeast, like St. Augustine, have yielded wheat and domesticated old world grapes and things like tomatoes and other things like that. But these guys, from the archives, we have no, they were not carrying seeds, they were not carrying anything that would really feed them. They were expecting to live off of the native people when they got there. And they were carrying the supplies that they had, which weren't that many. They had no pack animals with them, unlike Joara didn't, the Ampardo didn't, De Soto did, but he had pigs. But the Pardo men were all on their own feet, and they carried a few casks of wine, and they carried hardtack, biscuits, and they carried some wheels of cheese, but nothing that would, would preserve and be recognizable to an archaeobotanist like me. What we are finding is stuff that's very typical of native cuisine as prepared by indigenous women. We have, as I said, a lot of corn, a lot of nuts, fruits, passion fruits, grapes, persimmons, blackberries, sumac, squash. We get beans, no beans at Cahokia, but beans here. Wild plants, but not anywhere near the seed yield that we get from Cahokia and other American bottom sites. And even though it's not a food, we get the tobacco, as I mentioned. And there's very good animal bone representation, with especially bear, deer, turtles are extremely well represented there. This just to show nuts are in almost all the samples, just like maize is. They're extreme. The counts are high. The weights are very high. The percentage of samples in which they come are high. So it's not. It's even though there's still a lot of corn, it's balanced out, especially by nuts and somewhat by fruits. And hickory and acorn are the most common nuts. I think they must have been eating a lot of chestnuts. Chestnut has very, very thin shell. It's going to be hard to distinguish from acorn, although I tried. I looked very carefully. And I think that we're just missing it. I think they were eating it, and just because of the way that it got burned up, or it got thrown somewhere, because it doesn't make good fuel. It didn't enter the fire very often. I don't know of chestnut being identified at all from the American bottom. I was especially interested in how much grape and how much persimmon we were finding. In the archives, there was very little mention of food at all, but as they traveled across the land, both DeSoto's archivists and Pardo's noted whenever they saw a place that had a lot of grapes, because they didn't have enough wine with them to satisfy an Iberian appetite, and so they were constantly looking for grapes. And then maypops were just everywhere. And if you all know the purple passion flower, we can grow it here as an ornamental, but I don't ever find it when I go out, collecting or on nature walks. Have you ever seen it? No. And I think it has been very rarely identified from American bottom samples, but hardly at all. But it was. It has, not only can it be made into wine, and has been other species in South America, but it has sedative properties. And I like to think of those men being really highly stressed out and wanting anything that was going to calm them down. But that's just my speculation. Okay, so we have local foods grown by native farmers, which in the Southeast is going to be women. There's no reason to suspect that men were doing anything except clearing the heavy undergrowth when it needed to be cleared, sometimes engaging in tobacco farming, helping in times of emergency. But otherwise, and going out and to visit with the young men, going out to visit with the young girls, and maybe doing a little bit of work, but not very much. And the processing debris, the nutshell and the corn cob fragments, indicate that inside the compound area that we had the native women actually working and doing. There's it's just incomprehensible that the men were shucking and grinding their own corn and making their own hominy. Charles Hudson, in his volume on the Pardo expedition, says what is most noteworthy is that Pardo and his men, the degree to which they were dependent on the infrastructure of the Indian societies. Little in the way of food that they brought with them on both expeditions. Pardo made 2 expeditions, and thus his need to live off the tribute and hospitality of the Indians, which he was remarkably good at doing. So I might have gotten a little bit ahead of myself here in terms of the historical background, but as I said, DeSoto was there calling it Joara, and then in 1565, can you all see at the back, the St. Augustine down in Florida was founded, and then the very next year, Santa Elena, up on what's now Parris Island, South Carolina, the very southern tip in South Carolina, and then Pardo arrives with 2 ships from Spain directly. A lot of these Spanish colonies were founded from somewhere in the Caribbean, and they brought supplies with them from much closer. And of course, St. Augustine had to receive a lot of resupplies from ships from the Caribbean and elsewhere. But these guys arrive at Santa Elena directly from Spain. They're met at Santa Elena, where there's not enough food for them. And so immediately they're sent off into the interior, and in order to establish relationships with the Native Americans who have their own food, and also just to not eat up everything that is actually not available at Santa Elena at the time. So December the 1st, 1566, Pardo and his men leave Santa Elena for the interior. There's about 120 to 125 men on that expedition. Pardo was the third leader of a Spanish expedition into the interior. There were others, of course, on the coast. But this De Soto was the first. And then Luna comes up from Pensacola area up into Coosa, up into northern Georgia. And then Pardo comes in from Santa Elena and builds, and he's the first to actually build anything substantial not just pass through, but actually build a bunch of forts that you probably can't see are designated by diamonds on that map. His goals were to find a route to the silver mines in Zacatecas in western Mexico, northwestern Mexico. They had no idea how big the continent was. Yet nobody had connected that, had the geography well established. They were trying, unlike De Soto, who was really heavy-handed. Pardo, in his instructions from Menendez, the leader at Santa Elena, were to establish good rapport with the Indians. Although the first thing that they were doing probably didn't help was to inform that they were subjects of the King of Spain, ask if they wanted priests to help make them good Christians. And they had gifts. They had trade goods. They had some nice cloth, and they had beads, and they had some metal objects which were highly desirable. Not enough, but they had a bunch. And of course, they all wanted to get rich. They were all going off prospecting every chance they had, looking for precious metals and other resources. So they arrived on New Year's Eve of 1566, and Pardo himself was only there for 2 weeks in early January. Then he left 30 men at Joara, and under a sergeant named Moyano, and he then returned to Santa Elena. And he did not get back. Before Pardo got back, in the spring of '67, Moyano took some men up into the mountains, and he went with a contingent of Joara warriors because there were probably some scores to settle, some enemy things, rivalries going on between Joara and the people some of the people living in the mountains. So he attacked several villages up there. And that was almost certainly why the Joara natives were as welcoming as they were to the Spaniards, because they had seen De Soto and his guns in power, and they said, these guys can help us with our, some of our rivals. Pardo comes back in September of that year, with more than 100 men. Moyano had gotten into some trouble up in the mountains, and he was barricaded in one of the Proto-Cherokee villages, having only left 31 men at Fort San Juan. Fort San Juan is the one at Joara. And then, Moyano got rescued, and Pardo and his men built 4 more forts in the region, including this one Guattari that is off to the east that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then Pardo spent 2 more weeks at Fort San Juan, leaving a small garrison of men at there as when he returned to Santa Elena, leaving a small garrison of men at Fort San Juan, Joara, the bury site. Is this too confusing? And Pardo never went back, but the next summer, or June or late May, the people the Spaniards at Santa Elena learned that Fort San Juan had been destroyed by the natives, and that all the Spaniards, except for 3 that we can name, and there might have been more, but the archives only mention these 3, had been killed, and one of the survivors was named Juan Martín de Badajoz. So it was a revolt, a successful revolt. There was never another successful settlement in the interior by the Spaniards. Spain had lost that territory. Then the next thing that happened was much later, in the early 1600s, decades later, when Jamestown was founded and the English started expanding from Virginia. Or else we would all be speaking Spanish, is what I think. So you all know that there were DeSoto Chronicles. They are summarized, and not all of them, but as much as possible, in 2 volumes of this Clayton et al., the DeSoto Chronicles. Gentlemen of Elvis, Rangel, Arcelazo de la Vega, and others. But they were only there for a maximum of 2 weeks. The archivists differ in terms of the amount of time they give for DeSoto having spent at Joara. But there's some very, very interesting information about women, about a woman especially, the Lady of Cofidichequi, who was a powerful chief at a site that was in between Santa Elena and Joara, closer to Santa Elena on the Watery River in South Carolina. So she's also known as Talimiko, Miko being a word for chief, a Muskogean word for chief, and she was a regional or paramount chief. And there's they were just immensely impressed by her. Here she is greeting DeSoto and putting a string of pearls around his neck. All of the Spaniards, all of the accounts from the DeSoto expedition demonstrate that they were in immense awe of the Lady of Cofidichequi. They just describe her as a magnificent individual, and she had a sizable region that she had control over. And they across this region, she was given tribute, and she shared her tribute with DeSoto in the terms of wealth, pearls, and surplus food. And we think that she did this. We don't know for sure her motive, but we don't think it was just the goodness of her heart and hospitality. It was again to get him to placate him, to get him to not destroy them, to move on through her territory as fast as he possibly could. And but DeSoto, even after all of this hospitality, took her took her captive, and along with what they called, the gentleman of Elvis, one of the DeSoto chroniclers, called her slave women, so that the Indians might show respect because of her. In all the towns through which the governor passed, the cacica, which is their word for this chief, female chief, ordered the Indians to come and carry the loads from one town to the other. We traversed her lands for 100 leagues, in which we saw she was very well obeyed, for all the Indians did with great efficiency and diligence what she ordered of them. They made it to Joara, and that was pretty much the edge of her territory, although that was part of it at the time. And as they moved westward into the mountains, she escaped, and we think she went back to Joara, and we don't know what happened from there. Then there are other archival documents from the Pardo expedition summarized in this volume by Charles Hudson. He lists the provisions and the gifts. He describes Pardo requesting that houses be built by natives and stores of food provided for them, and he received this. His requests were honored to a surprising degree. I have combed those documents for any descriptions of meals or food, and there is hardly anything. But there are very, very few mentions of women. There's one interesting one from the mountains when Pardo went up there to rescue his Sergeant Moyano. He saw a man dressed as a woman who was walking with other women, and he said, "What's going on?" You know, and he was the native person described. "Oh yeah, that's the chief's brother, and he doesn't live like a man. He doesn't want to do the things that other men do." So it was what we would call today a two-spirit person, and at the time, I think the French word berdache was used. And that's the first, we think that's the first European description of a native two-spirit, which is really quite common across North America. At the time, the Joara Miko was male. The Lady of Kofitacheki had, of course, was a female, but the Joara Miko was male. But at Guattari, one of the forts to the east of Fort San Juan, the leader was a woman, and in fact, there were the Miko, which was a higher level leader, and a sub-chief, Orata, was also a female. And they did mention an old cacica, or old chief, cacica being the Spanish feminine, of course, even though the original word that they got, cacique, probably came from the Caribbean and was non-gendered. A cacique could be a man or a woman, and they had both. And they had given her a metal axe as a gift. And there's all kinds of speculation about what this might mean as far as the Lady of Kofitacheki, one of her, you know, if there might be a connection there, but we don't know. We do know, or we have very good reason to believe that women had an extremely important role in the revolt itself. So one of the three named survivors, Juan Martin, who was had become married to a native woman who they called Teresa Martin. He was described as having walked back. He described it to another Spaniard that he walked back to Santa Elena, taking cover hiding during the day and moving at night, because not only had Fort San Juan been destroyed, but all of the forts had been destroyed at the same time, and it was like a general regional revolt, and things were not safe for any Spaniard. But he did make it back, and his description was that the soldiers were lured out of the forts and killed with great cruelty. And he said that the Spaniards' excessive demands for food had been a cause. And then his wife, Teresa Martin, Juan Martin died in a revolt that happened later in Santa Elena in the 1670s. But she lived much longer. They had two daughters who are also known to have lived. And she ended up at St. Augustine. And in 1600, much later, there was a relacion, a testimony that was taken, commissioned by the crown, the King of Spain, and they were sort of, the governor of St. Augustine at the time was interested in possibly making another foray into the interior, maybe having another colony. So they interviewed the two native women at St. Augustine who were from Joara or nearby, one of them being Teresa Martin. And this was a formal relacion, meaning that a scribe interviewed not only these two women, but a couple of other people, Spaniards, or Europeans. One of them, I think, was actually Welsh, and asked questions and wrote it all down, and it was very official. And the scribe would read it back to the person that he interviewed, and make sure that he got everything right, and then both people signed it. So she, Teresa Martin, as she was known then, testified that when Pardo did not return in 3 or 4 months, the soldiers had committed improprieties with Indian women, and this had angered their men. And that's the way it's translated in the Hudson accounts. It's written in Latin, So I think there's some room for retranslation. But I'd like to read the way that Rodnick et al., the chapter in the Mississippian Women volume, ends, that women were important power brokers within Mississippian societies and in Mississippian engagements with the Spanish conquistadors and colonists. In some cases, women made it possible for early European settlements to sustain themselves, but with that support withdrawn, those settlements and even the individuals they were entangled with could not and did not last. And I am just very excited by the fact that there's a new look at that relation by historians, and there's going to be evidently a new translation, and from what I've seen the snippets of so far that were just published this year, there are some significant, a few at least, additions or changes in the way things are translated. And it mentions more food. Even if it's just a little bit, it's exciting to me, because one of those things is, it mentions chestnuts, which makes me want to go back and look at all those little things I called acorn. And it mentions and she talks about the large quantities of fish and nuts that are in such quantity that they extract oil from them. And I don't know of any earlier mention of the extraction of nut oils, which would be like hickory nut oil, or the Canugi balls that the Cherokees still use, or that kind of emphasis. But the fact that she mentioned corn and the other crops, but the placement on nuts jives with the amount of nuts that were recovered by the flotation. And when she was asked to specifically compare St. Augustine, there on the coast of Florida, with the resources in the interior, she said there's no comparison. St. Augustine is worth nothing compared to her homeland. In her land, hunger is unknown. But they didn't go back. Charles Hudson has described leadership positions in general across southeastern societies. The paramount chiefs are cacique grandes. The regional chiefs are micos. And I mentioned that there was a female chief at Guattari. Local chiefs are aratis, another one at Guattari. And then mediators and speakers. And women held all of these leadership roles at some places and times in the general Southeast, except for war chiefs. A graduate student at the University of Florida, who's now the city archaeologist in Washington, D.C., Ruth Tricoli, wrote her dissertation about women leaders in chiefdom societies and came up with of the southeastern United States, and came up with a total of 94 across these regions, and says that many more are probably unrecorded, and that the European observers, I'm trying to think of a diplomatic way of putting this, they were not attuned to the social gender role differences. They were very much coming from patriarchal and male-dominated societies. So it's amazing the fact that we've got that many. And that's not just from the 1600s, it's from later centuries as well. But it shows that it was not that unusual. It was the minority. It wasn't half and half. But it was not something that was seen as being unusual. Linguistically and culturally diverse region of the Carolinas, where Joara is located, had numerous, this is from the chapter about the Carolinas, numerous women leaders from 1540 through the 1680s. The caciques of the interior were present prior to sustained contact with the Europeans. Sometimes it's been suggested that this was because so many men had died, they had to rely upon women, but that wasn't the case. Female leadership was a long-standing tradition in this region and cut across the diverse cultures that were present. Okay, how much more time do I have? I'm not going to talk at all as long about Cahokia. Much shorter. You all know where it is, and you know how wonderful it is. Okay, the diverse agriculture. Women were farmers, and they had a different, in spite of the fact they had an emphasis on corn, no beans, squash, and sunflowers, and a lot of members of what we call the Eastern Agricultural Complex, many of which are lost crops, but were not weeds, not just weedy crops, but fully domesticated crops like the Chenopodium, the cousin of quinoa. And they had different seasonalities, they had different demands in terms of moisture and soil and other aspects of soil, and they were a very, very important part of the subsistence economy. So, along with corn, and I think that women, and it's often overlooked in the literature. You can, if you could go back to the exhibits at Cahokia, you would see in the Wetlands and Waterways exhibit that women are in fact recognized, given credit as being the farmers. But it's not that obvious from the other exhibits. Sorry, and in some of the literature, I love this book. It's a really good book. But it says planting time and later at harvest time, every able-bodied person was helping to produce corn. So not only is the emphasis on corn and not on the agrobiodiversity that was actually present, but to say every able-bodied person is almost certainly incorrect. There would have been very rare times when it wasn't just women. I know of no evidence otherwise. So I see agriculture as a path to higher status in terms of if you weren't already born with it, even if you were born with pretty high status, you probably had a head start at a good field, good land. But you also still had to be industrious and generous. And I think women who were the farmers were administrators over the distribution of fields and surplus. I don't see this as being centralized in any kind of, high muckety-muck who was not actually a farmer. I see women as being agents of social interaction. When all these people are moving into the American bottom, into Cahokia during the 1000s, around 1050, Big Bang, they needed land for one thing, and they needed to be integrated into the larger society. And I see farming with women as the primary agents as having been a major, major force in that. Possibly there were sodalities among the Hidatsa historically. There was a goose society that were the women of childbearing age who were the farmers. The most active and strongest farmers. And that would have been one way, if there was such a thing at Cahokia, where that could have been achieved. The women would have been leaders of rituals of renewal and fertility. We can call them priestesses. Or if they weren't members of the priesthood themselves, they could have just been necessary as conductors of rituals and keepers of knowledge that figured strongly into the priesthood, or even more likely or they chose who knew who was going to be a good leader or not. Okay, in the chapter in Mississippian Women, I talked some about weavers, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to skip over this a lot. We find weavers reflected in the archaeological record primarily at Cahokia and elsewhere in the form of spindle whorls, but very occasionally there are remnants of twine or woven mats or something else preserved just fortuitously and by careful archaeological excavation. This is from Kuhneman Mound, twine fabric from Kuhneman Mound. Spindle whorls from the Grossman side. The Grossman side's up here in the uplands to the east. And Susan Ault has been a really contributor to the recognition of these spindle whorls and what they mean. So we know from Osage ethnography that women weavers played an important role in the initiation rites of the historic Osage. And this is also, several people have written about this, and one of them is a historian, Ty Edwards, who wrote the book, published the book Osage Women in Empire, I think in 2018, which was right after I had finished writing Feeding Cahokia. I didn't get to rely on it anymore. But she emphasizes then how important that the women were, and that in this and other rites, skill, knowledge, and wealth were all necessary. Okay, so this is the way hierarchy was depicted. I don't know if this exhibit is going to go back up. I hope not. Okay. But basically you can see a four-tiered, and I don't have necessarily a problem with that, but they're dressed differently. The figures are dressed differently, and some are male and some are female. So here's a man on the top. Here are the second tier are all men. The third tier is divided into three, and you don't get a woman until the bottom. That's when you start, and that's what they call the heads of clans and communities. But the women depictions are absent from the top, from the chiefs or the elites. And then here you get lots of women down here among the dominants. So Bill took this picture from me. Thank you. So what's wrong with this picture? So I'm going to read this just so I don't start spouting off some rant. So I personally do not know how Cahokia actually worked. And I'm not trying to minimize the degree of hierarchy or complexity, but I feel strongly that attempts to depict leadership positions, power, and authority need to recognize women at the highest levels in order to come close to any semblance of validity for any Mississippian society. Recently, there, of course, has been more and more recognition of women at Cahokia, and one of the projects that does this is the work that Susan Ault and Tim Pocketat and I'm sorry, Chip. Who's their collaborator at Emerald? I should know that. At Emerald Mound, which is a part of at the north end of the Richland complex up east of here. And then the reanalysis of Mound 72 has recognized more women than originally recognized. And then just in the very last American Antiquity that's come out in print, Caddo pottery specialists have been recognized as living for multiple generations in the East St. Louis precinct, part of Cahokia, part of Greater Cahokia. And I'm going to skip over these things, Emerald Mound, the lunar alignments, and what that probably means as far as the feminine powers, recognize the importance of feminine powers, causal significance in the founding and enlargement of Emerald and Cahokia. Reinterpretation of the beaded burial, not one man on top with another, on top of shell beads with another male underneath, but both of those central bead burials were on top rather than one on top and one below, and one was male and one was female, and nearby was another male-female pair. And of all of the individuals in that sub-1 area, 10 females, 7 males, and 6 in a condition that was too poor for gender to be assigned. Reflecting, just as Ty Edwards emphasizes throughout her book about Osage women and power, and is a fundamental complementarity of male and female powers. And just as that Washobi ritual, the weaving ritual on modern Osage, reflects that fundamental complementarity, which I didn't talk about, did I? You have to read the chapter. And then this article by Sean Lambert in page 4 in American Antiquity, that that Caddo-style pottery has been recognized at Cahokia in the American Bottom for some time. That's not anything new. But Sean Lambert has gone back and page 4 into the collections from the East St. Louis precinct, and he knows cattle pottery. That's what his dissertation was on the University of, and he knows it extremely well. Cattle pottery was beautiful. Cattle pottery was just so fine, beautifully engraved and incised bottle forms, carinated bowls that you just defy gravity, and thin walled beakers and other pots. He recognized bottles from the East St. Louis precinct that had not been recognized before because they weren't whole. They were just like a sherd from the globule area, the rounded area. He looked more carefully at the temper and found that somebody else might have noticed this sooner, but fine grog temper, which was a Caddo pottery manufacturing technique, whereas shell tempering was much more common. But the fine grog tempering on these Caddo pots were made from shell tempered pot sherds. So, and then there had already been Mary Beth Trubid had already done some neutron activation and another petrographic analysis that was making the case, which he supports, that these Caddo-style pots were manufactured here. They weren't trade goods. They were local manufacture. Plus, they go farther into what they call the stylistic grammar and say, this is not a copy. This is not somebody just, looking at the Caddo pottery and trying to imitate it. This is made by Caddo specialists. It's so close. Everything is so close to it. And with that combination of manufacture and style leads them to conclude that, and I have no reason to doubt it, it totally convinces me, that, and not to the very end did they mention that this is likely women because women were almost certainly the potters, but they don't interpret them as meaning that these are, retainers or captives or anything like that. That these are these specialists are there to contribute and for what they are going to for their own reasons to be part of this bigger phenomenon at Cahokia. Ceramic objects that early Caddo craft specialists produced can now be understood as more culturally and historically transformative and further entangled in the histories of Cahokia. These objects will thus be now viewed as devices that expose Caddo's and Cahokia's complex social flows of engagements. And I really like that approach, and I think it's more and more common among the scholars of the next generation. So, conclusions. Women likely held all levels of leadership positions at Cahokia, as they did across the Southeast. As producers of food, women sustained Mississippian society, and they were respected as such. Exhibits, talks, or written works that fail to include women as high-level leaders are biased. And hopefully what we've learned about Joara and the sites that have documents can help us make more, I don't know, creative or newer types of inferences about the sites like Cahokia that don't. Okay, sorry it took so long.
Anybody have any questions for Gayle? Or answers?
We have several from the internet.
Is there a chance that the old woman who never dies bottles are representative of leadership roles of women?
I think, as you probably know from Carol Diaz-Fernandez and Jim Duncan, I think they represent a powerful feminine, the Earth Mother type figure that has come down as old woman who never dies or grandmother, but that back then it's probably safer, according to Tom Emerson and others, to just see as an Earth Mother. But I think that reflects the possible role of women priestesses, of women leaders, of sodalities, of women's role in general, real, actual women. But they're totally devoted to this Earth Mother in ways that reflect their roles, their leadership. Yes.
So based on what you said, do you think that the top leader may have been a female?
At times, I don't think we should rule that out. I don't think we know that. I wouldn't say that I can point to one, but I see no reason to rule it out. And also, I'm not sure there was just one top one. All these different groups coming together, there would have been multiple leaders, like multiple chiefs. I know Paul Welch once wrote an article that had the passage in it. Instead of "take me to your chief," when you got to Cahokia, you probably said "take me to your chiefs," right? But yeah, I think there were women. There were more likely than not. There were women up there at the top.
We have questions.
Okay.
They're probably going to be out of order because I accumulated them. Has LIDAR been done at the Berry site? Do you know?
Sorry?
LIDAR, has it been done at the Berry site?
LIDAR. I don't know of any LIDAR having been done. No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
There was there are multiple geophysical on the ground, and there've been a lot of use of drones, but I don't know of any that involved LIDAR. Sorry, I should ask that.
And then are there any clear mushroom consumptions or pawpaws? And can't maypops be toxic?
I don't know of maypops being toxic. No, they can be fermented. And the mushrooms?
Yeah, any mushroom consumption or pawpaws?
Pawpaws. We did not find any pawpaws. So that's one of the things you don't find very often. The very few pawpaw identifications from all of the thousands and thousands of features that have been floated and analyzed from the American bottom, analyzed by other people. They are making more of a case now for datura in some parts of the southeast. And then there's the black drink, which of course was the residues are being. I don't know of any evidence for mushrooms.
Okay. Could deforestation of the larger site have contributed to the different food sources, beans and sunflowers? Deforestation of the larger site have contributed to different food sources like beans and sunflowers.
There was a lot of clearing, and for the fields. I think that, and the pollen, the coring of the Horseshoe Lake and others has shown that pre-maize intensification, this would have been the first millennium, this would have been the woodland period, the first millennium CE, that there was a lot of clearing. I myself would not necessarily use the word deforestation, but it was there were big fields and they were left open, and originally trees had to be cut down for the fields. So there was a connection. I don't think that anything that you would call deforestation created a need. I think there were still the hardwood forests that, well, certainly in Greater Cahokia, they would have had access to groves of hickory nuts. Plus, they were managing those. Those were such an important part of food. And the Europeans, described them as orchards. They were thinned and cleared so that they weren't like, a jumble of all kinds of trees. But the best nut-bearing trees were intentionally left standing and for their productivity and for their use of food.
Okay, so it says when you say there's no evidence men were involved, what do you use to, what determines that?
That's ethnographic. That's that across from the Iroquois down to the coast of the Gulf Coast, the Caddo, and then across everybody in between and across to the plains. For Eastern North America, it's not true of the Southwest. That was their men and women were the farmers, but the Europeans were constantly trying to get the Eastern North American men to farm, and they were just, they just didn't want anything to do with it. In some cases, according to Jim Duncan, there were spiritual taboos against it, and the incest for them to till Mother Earth, and there were just in ethnic group after ethnic group, or tribe after tribe after tribe, the women did the farming. So it's ethnographic evidence.
Okay, I think I have a couple more. Was meat consumption lopsided in that area like it was among Mississippians, with mostly the elite eating the major proteins?
I don't know of any of the kinds of isotopic analyses or other studies that would indicate. I know that Kristen Hedman has done that at Cahokia. I don't know of anything like that for east of there.
Okay, and then were nut oils used as binding ingredients or for the preservation of grains, etc.?
Not that I know of. They were stock. They were like we would have chicken stock, frozen or readily available for the base of a lot of things that we might cook, or our grandmothers at least. But the hickory nut milk or oil would have been that basic cooking ingredient, but not as a binder or thickener, just as the basis of and even corn, hominy would go into that, and so it would be to combine as a porridge or soup, or not necessarily porridge, but soup or stew. And then you had a special, or by itself, hickory nut milk, or hickory nut oil could be used for cooking and other types of cooking, but not as so much as a thickener.
Okay, I think we have one more, and it says, what was the reasoning of requiring the people to be Spanish subjects?
Oh, that was their belief system. That was what I've heard it described as arrogance. I have Spanish ancestry, so it was their strong ideology that as Christians, as civilized members of European societies, that they should spread this, that they should that the natives were inferior, Native Americans were inferior, and needed to be shown the light and brought under their world order.
Perfect. Lots of questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
about